Hello and welcome to Merthyr's Hidden Past, a weekly podcast brought to you by Cyfarthfa Castle Museum and Art Gallery. My name is Christopher Parry and I work in Cyfarthfa Castle. And Merthyr's Hidden Past is a weekly podcast all about the history of Merthyr Tydfil, the town and the borough. But as many of you who have listened before know, or should know at least, if you're listening to the introductions, this is a podcast about the more lesser known stories in Merthyr's history. This week, the history we are going to be talking about is a bit of a unique one to Merthyr because it's all revolving around the Merthyr Rising of 1831. And yeah, I thought it would be interesting to look at the previous riots and uprisings and rebellions, however you want to term them really, that happened before the Merthyr Rising, and then talk a bit about the Merthyr Rising itself, because I'm always fascinated how the earlier kind of large-scale people rebelling against authority in Merthyr are not as well known and as well talked about as the Merthyr Rising, for good reasons, don't get me wrong. But I thought it would be interesting to look at them through the eyes of three different letters, really. So I've got one letter from 1800, one letter from 1816, and one letter from 1831. And we're just going to be using them as kind of talking points or jumping on points for this week's episode. So have a listen, let us know your thoughts on the episode. But anyway, without further ado, I'll get on with this week's episode, which is all about three letters from three riots and the road to the Merthyr Rising of 1831. In September 1800, food costs were drastically high. Wages were low. And this is the key part of all the major rebellions and uprisings and riots in Merthyr. There was many people for a lot of years previous to 1800 that were fighting for political rights and political battles, to reform Parliament, to get equal voting, to get fairer pay, to get more of a permanent pay, because pay was obviously linked to the price of iron mainly and coal in Merthyr and things like that. So if the price of iron or coal dipped, mainly iron in fairness in the early days, then the wage packets would be affected, and eventually if the price stays low, then sackings will happen and people get laid off. And so there was always this group of people scattered throughout South Wales who were fighting for rights and workers' rights essentially. But in 1800 and in other years, it would be a combination of those battles with really extreme conditions around food shortages and very low wages that would bolster those ranks and those numbers, and people would join that campaign because obviously the need is more imminent, which is quite a natural thing when you think about it for humankind really. And you'll see similarities, or I hope you'll see similarities between the formations of all of these riots. So anyway, September 1800, food costs were drastically high, wages were low, and the cost of iron was fairly cheap at that point, and a mob formed to try and get wages to be stabilised and stop dropping. And that mob wasn't formed in Merthyr. It was formed in Pontypool and other industrial districts across Monmouthshire and whatnot. And what started happening is this core group started going out around the industrial centres and putting out furnaces. And what the idea between the putting out of the furnaces is that they would be stopping the main source of income. So people would have to listen because work has been put on hold. So they would put the blast furnaces out of blast, cease work. And then the other thing is they would try to convince the people working in these ironworks and collieries to come on board. So slowly but surely, the more this mob moved around the industrial districts, the more numbers gathered to their cause. And eventually, obviously, Merthyr being the centre of industrial action for South Wales at that point, they were heading towards Merthyr. They also were targeting unfair shops and provision places. Now, the truck shop system is one of these things that's often talked about in Merthyr, but it's often kind of misunderstood as well, is because ultimately people say, oh yeah, the ironmasters were unfair because they operated the truck shop token system, which essentially was a system where you wouldn't pay your workers in cash that could be spent anywhere. You would pay them in a specific coin or note of some kind that could only be spent in shops associated with that particular ironworks or managerial setup, essentially. And then the ironmasters would hike the price of the daily provisions up to earn more off their workers, or at least that's what the problem with the system was, is that it wasn't being monitored. So the ironmasters shops could essentially charge more than other shops, but then they couldn't shop around, they couldn't go elsewhere for anything else. In Merthyr in particular, because the truck shop token system wasn't that widespread in Merthyr compared to other industrial districts. So, for example, Cyfarthfa Ironworks never operated a truck shop token system, never. There was other truck shop token systems in Dowlas and Pendarren and elsewhere, but they were quite minimal. They weren't used outright. There was one associated with Pendarren, and this was targeted in 1800 on Merthyr's High Street when the mob came and descended on Merthyr. They would go around the ironworks, put the furnaces out, and then get more people on their ranks, obviously. And then they went to a shop on the high street, which was opposite the Angel Inn on the bottom of the high street. And this shop was run by the Pendarren Ironworks shop. Run by the Pendarren Ironworks company, sorry. And essentially what they were doing is they sacked the shop. So they went in, they destroyed all the provisions, threw the salt, the sugar, the pepper, everything out onto the streets. Supposedly many people were gathering up salt and sugar and all provisions in aprons and whatever they could and getting away with it. So it was pandemonium to a certain extent because the shop was being absolutely destroyed and gutted and everything being cast out onto the street. And then they were forcing the ironmasters of the Pendarren Company and the shopkeepers to sign an agreement. And this, again, is one of those things that is an amazing, really, thing about all of the uprisings and rebellions across these years that we'll talk about, is at the heart there was always someone who had a written agreement ready to be signed, because they knew that the only way that this had longevity is if they get some legal document signed to fix this or fix that. And one of the documents they were trying to get signed in 1800 was that the shopkeepers fixed their prices at a certain level so they could afford it. Now, this obviously got wind by the ironmaster of the time of Pendarren Ironworks, who was Samuel Humphrey. And the first letter we look at is a letter he wrote on October the 1st, 1800. And he wrote this to his local lord and duke and all that type of thing, just to update him on the situation in Merthyr. Now, I'll read you extracts to that because it kind of gives you a bit of an indication of what happened in the riots and how the ironmaster himself kind of perceived it. So it starts with, "My Lord Duke, I have had the honour of your Grace's letter on the 27th of September, and I have now the satisfaction to inform you that the riot is at an end and all things are restored to their usual course. Having corresponded for a few days past with General Roke on the subject of the disturbance at Merthyr, and your mentioning he has communicated the same to your Grace, you are fully acquainted with the nature and extent of them. I believe I can say from accounts given to me, a more violent and furious mob was scarcely ever heard of, and nothing could pacify them, being fully bent on plundering this place. The agreement the shopkeepers were under threat of signing to fix the price of provisions was declared void soon after the arrival of the troops in the town. If this agreement had continued in a few days, the consequences would have been very great for the mob, because they were determined to proceed to different markets and create riots there until the shopkeepers agreed the same terms. It was thought at one point that they were up to 4,000 people together in Merthyr. I have very little doubt that political principles have in some degree influenced the minds of the lower class of people, in addition to the high price of provisions." Now, there's a few things to kind of pick out of that letter. First and foremost is the agreement that the shopkeepers were forced to sign was essentially just fixing the standard price of provisions, namely bread, butter, all kind of everyday goods in working class life, really, and sort of fix them. But the problem is literally as soon as the riot ended, Samuel Humphrey declared the signing of that document to be void. So they just essentially signed the document, waited for the troops to arrive, and then tore the document up and carried on as is usual. The other thing is that they were talking about how the mob was so unified in this approach to kind of overhauling the shopkeepers and these prices of provisions, is they were planning on going to other markets around South Wales to essentially fix the prices of corn, grain, all these types of things that are needed in everyday provisions, really, for working class people. And yeah, the other thing is the size of that group. So by the time it went from Pontypool to all the other industrial districts, and by the time it descended on Merthyr, there was over 4,000 people gathering on the streets of Merthyr. So the military was called in, as the letter kind of outlines. Initially, volunteer forces were called in because there were many volunteer brigades in Merthyr. For example, volunteer forces, Watkin George, the famous Cyfarthfa engineer, was a captain in the local volunteers. Richard Crochet was a member in it. A lot of other notable townspeople headed up local volunteer forces. And a lot of locals were part of it as well. You're talking hundreds of people locally were part of the volunteers. Why, you may think, are they fighting for that rather than fighting for, the price, everyday prices? It's because they were getting paid extra to be part of the volunteer groups. When the proper armed forces arrived in the town as well, the really, the professional military arrived, there's some accounts that they really came in with all guns a-blazing to kind of quell the riot as immediately as they can, and they did, apparently, because as soon as these guys came in, everyone kind of dispersed and stopped. There's even one story that's been handed down, that when one military man arrived in the town to show off his prowess with a sword, he sliced a dog in half outside the Star Inn in Merthyr Tydfil, and then another soldier came along and sliced the crown off a man's head, off his hat, which was on his head. And so these soldiers weren't messing around. I mean, it's the only time I've ever read a historical document that someone cut a dog in half to show their sword skill. There were lots of arrests at the end of this, but there were actually 2 deaths as well. A gentleman called Aaron Williams, who was a labourer at Cyfarthfa, and Samuel Hill, who was a collier, but it's not known where he was from at this point, were arrested and then later hung. Now, you don't hear much about these guys at all, and they were not hung for murdering or causing any physical damage. They were hung just purely as being ringleaders of this riot and this rebellion. And yeah, they scarcely a kind of footnote in history, those 2 guys are now, really, at all, because this uprising has been forgotten about totally. But that leads us to the next uprising in Merthyr, which happened in October 1816. Now, me and my colleague Ben at the museum are kind of fascinated in a weird way with 1816, because it's the year without the summer, the year without the sun in the sky, really, because 1816 was the year that the world was feeling volcanic summer, essentially, which people in Merthyr didn't know this at the time, and a lot of people in industrial districts didn't know this at the time, but Mount Tambora in Indonesia exploded in late 1815, and it cast volcanic ash into the air. And for the next year or so, it would block out the sun, and crops would fail all over the world. Now, this is not just kind of Britain or anywhere, like, it's literally all over the world. People actually nicknamed it, and this is by far my favourite nickname for a year that I've ever heard. They nicknamed it 1800 and froze to death, which is an amazing nickname. The year was horrendous, and food was scarcer than ever. Add to that the Napoleonic Wars were just ending, and whereas people thought that there would be a boost in economy after the Napoleonic Wars, it was the opposite, particularly for Britain, because Britain had almost bankrupted itself fighting the Napoleonic Wars, and the economic recovery was very slow. So immediately in 1816 there was a shortage of food, wages were lower than they ever have been really, and again these people who were agitating for reform and for rights in these times started gathering pace and started getting together. So in Monmouthshire, once again, they rose against wage reductions and job losses, and they made their way to Merthyr. People in the town this time, having been through 1800, began preparations, so special constables as well as volunteers were sworn in at Pendarren, and the historian Charles Wilkins mentions that a villainous-looking pike was ordered and handed out and created in blacksmiths, and it was handed out to managers and agents at Pendarren because they were not having the same repeat as last time. But this crowd was gathering pace, and so there was about 400 of them by this point going to other industrial districts again, putting furnaces out. But they had word that they were coming to Dowlas. And so the special constables got together and started to think, right, we've got to stop this before it gets into the town, and they are able to turn the furnaces off here and then gather more numbers to their ranks. Because when these riots came into Merthyr, because the population was so big, they only needed to convince a certain small percentage of Merthyr to be with them, and already you've got thousands upon thousands, an uncontrollable crowd. And so they thought they'd try to stop it coming into Merthyr at Dowlas. So the special constables went up to Dowlas, they met the crowd there, and all was kind of a standoffish. And apparently a woman named Mary Morgan was up there, and she was there because she was trying to stop her husband, who was part of the special constables volunteer, people who were carrying pikes, and her son, who was a rioter. She was trying to stop them clashing because she obviously didn't want them to be on opposite ends. And so this woman, Mary Morgan, was apparently around on this landscape in between the two of them. And then a shot rang out. Someone fired a gun, and Mary Morgan was shot. And as soon as that shot rang out, pandemonium ensued. The rioters kind of progressed forward to the special constables, and the special constables, not being exceptionally well trained or that into this job really, I'm guessing, dispersed and immediately kind of scattered out to safety around the town. And that was it then. The rioters were in the town, and they began then to go around the town to gather more people to their ranks. The second letter we look at from 1816 is written by an anonymous shopkeeper slash baker slash provision guy. We don't know his name, but he sent a letter that appeared in various kind of news publications and things like that, just describing what happened to him and his experiences. And he starts off as follows. About 400 men rose from work at Tredegar Ironworks. They came to Rumney Works and put out the blast of the furnaces and pressed several men to go along to Dowlas Works. There they did the same. Also at Pendarren, they stopped all the furnaces. Their plea was an increase in wages. The mob passed Pontmorlas to Cyfarthfa Works and stopped all the blast furnaces and most of the works. They pressed many of the workmen to go along with them. They got to the Plymouth Works and stopped them all. In the evening, men came into the town in a large body, perhaps many thousands, some with sticks and others with pikes and other weapons in their hands. Several men knocked at my door about 10 o'clock. I opened it and asked what they wanted from me. Their answer was bread and cheese. I told them to behave peaceably, and I would give them all the bread and cheese I had. Which is what this shopkeeper did, incidentally. So he gave them all the bread and cheese they had, and he gave them everything he had. He even said in the letter that when he heard the riot was coming, he baked extra and created extra in the morning because he knew that this was going to happen. Because feeding the mob was one of the kind of things that, okay, how are we going to get this rising to be prolonged to get what we want, where we've got to get fed. So they would just sack shops and get food and provisions to feed the rioters so they could prolong the riot as much as possible. But the ironmasters all met to try and discuss how to end this riot, and so they met in the Castle Inn, which is similar to what they would do in 1831. When they arrived at the Castle Inn to discuss it, a local historian said they barely had time to have a sip of beer or a piece of bread before a crowd had formed outside the building. Now, by this time, the military had been called in yet again. So the military had flowed into the town really quick this time because of the last occasion in 1800. So they were flying into the town. And so when they came into the town, they were met by a crowd of 10,000 people or so. But fortunately, one of the ironmasters had the kind of idea of trying to pacify the crowd outside while they discussed how to end it, because they didn't really think that they could end this discussion, because they didn't want to fix and increase wages, because they felt so inclined to not do that. And the crowd would only disperse when they did that. But they had this idea that, well, obviously, quite rightly, that everybody's starving and hungry, and a lot of these people don't necessarily want to be here. Like, some of them are here for political reasons, as they were in 1800, as they will be in future Rising. But a lot of this crowd are here because they are hungry and starving, and they don't see another way to kind of get what they want, which is food and security, essentially. And so the ironmasters tried to pacify the crowd by handing out food and drink. And eventually, amazingly, this has seemed to have worked to a certain degree. And gradually, with the threat of the military opening fire on them, and with the pacifying of the crowd with food and drink, the crowd just generally gradually dispersed, which was an amazing thing, really, because in years to come, this didn't happen as so easily, because what happened there that day is a lot of innocent lives were spared, because the outcome of the military opening fire into a densely populated crowd like that would have been horrendous, as we'll find out in 1831. Not long after, around 40 or so ringleaders were jailed later that night. No one was hung. But that brings us to the final letter. And the final letter is an open letter that was produced on June the 4th, 1831. And this one is probably the one that you're all going to hate the most, because it's the one that I hate the most. And it starts off as follows. It was an open letter from the ironmasters to the people of Merthyr, and specifically the workmen of Merthyr. No one can lament more deeply than your masters do the dreadful occurrence of yesterday. They are grieved beyond measure that the blood of industrious men should be spilled by the rash attempt you made to disarm soldiers, brought here only to protect our property and persons against your threatened violence. Good God, that you should have been led by a speech of one violent man to commit so daring an attack as you did, one which was sure to produce the melancholy heartbreak in result which followed, and which all of us, masters and men, will regret till the end of their lives. There are now 10 times the number of soldiers to protect us and our property, and we implore you to consider the fatal effects of continuing the present unlawful proceedings. For your family's sake, at once come in a small number and meet us, and assure us of your immediate reliance upon our justice and feelings. Return to your work and put an end to this dreadful state of things, which must and will be worse every hour it continues. Your friends and masters. And that letter was put out on the 4th of June 1831, when the Merthyr Rising, as it's known, of 1831, was coming to an end. Now, I'm obviously not going to focus a massive chunk of time on this rising, because it is so dense. I mean, the reason why this rising is remembered over the other two is for a very good reason, because it was this birth of a political consciousness in Merthyr and the surrounding South Wales areas. Everyone was more unified than they had been in previous riots. They had a very identifiable kind of structure and cause to what they wanted. They didn't just want wages to be set. They wanted reform in Parliament, in voting. They wanted provisions to be priced the same and equally across the board. And they had this list. So this is basically, this rising is the culmination of what's been happening for years and years and years in Merthyr and the surrounding area. By the time they got to this point, they knew exactly what they wanted, and they knew that to get it, they had to use force, or at least that's what they convinced themselves of. But the rising, by the end of it, proved the one thing was beyond a shadow of a doubt, is that they weren't going to get it by these uprisings, by these riotous, violent uprisings. They weren't going to get it. The Merthyr Rising started in much the same way as the other risings did, in terms of the price of iron was the lowest it's ever been in the history of the iron making market, in particular for Wales. I mean, to give you an indication, in 1825, when Cyfarthfa Castle was built, iron was arguably up to about £12 to £14 per tonne. By the time the rising was kicking off, it was £4 to £6 per tonne. A massive reduction, and so wages took a hit, and then ironmasters unwilling to take the punt that the market would then right itself, because you're talking, this is 6 years or so into the decline of the market, and there was a price war going on which was bringing down the price of iron even more. And so eventually they just they felt the need to cut wages and to sack people and all that, and for the workers this was the end. They thought, no, we're not taking this anymore. So they all got together and they decided to take control of the town and all its infrastructure until their demands were met. And unheard of for a group of people to basically take control of the biggest industrial centre in an entire country. So Wales, and Merthyr in particular, was at the centre of the heart of industrial Britain. It genuinely was. And the workers rose and took over the whole thing and controlled it. So the Merthyr Rising was really different in its scale and its ambition in that respect, really. And in the same way as the sacking of the truck shops and the payment, the credit shops back in 1800 happened, the creditors in the courts of request, their shops were sacked and destroyed, because again, people felt that, yeah, obviously if I'm going to borrow money and now I'm not being paid and I'm being sacked and I've still got to give that money back, I haven't got any means to give it back. So they are repossessing my property for debts that I've incurred, but debts that I can't pay. So they felt that was unfair as well. And all of these things combined and really unified this crowd. And so they eventually ended up in, as the same as 1860, in crowds of over 10,000 people scattered outside the Castle Inn on Merthyr's High Street, where the ironmasters were inside. And this time there wouldn't be any pacifying the crowd with food. There was a passion to not give in at all, and that passion kind of overtook into violence, and the push against the soldiers that were marched outside the Castle Inn ended up in them opening fire and many people losing their lives and being injured. And eventually then the hanging of Dick Penderyn, Richard Lewis, for a crime that he didn't commit, and being a working class martyr for this cause, a man who was just there trying to change the day-to-day life of workers in Merthyr, was accused of a crime and then hung as a kind of demonstration of what will happen to people. He wasn't hung for any... If you look at Richard Lewis, he wasn't hung for stabbing a soldier. That was just an excuse. He was hung to show what will happen to people if they rebel, and that's it. And that's why he is a martyr. And that, again, all of that combines. The one thing I want you guys to take away from this, though, massively, is the fact that there wasn't another riot of this kind after this point. There wasn't a violent uprising after this point. Because at the end of this, Merthyr people came out worse to a certain degree. They came out with heavy losses. They didn't get the increase in wages. They didn't get the ironmasters to stop cutting jobs. they just got a lot of hurt and pain. And so it would really unify them to be a much more kind of sensible in that respect. And they would forcibly kind of use political means and petitions and people power in peacefully trying to gain what they want. For example, the Chartist movement would be a gigantic thing in Merthyr. And if you look at the demands in the Merthyr Rising, the similarities between the demands of the workers in the Rising are so similar to the demands that were eventually written down on the Charter at the end of the 1830s. It's ridiculous. It's because they were all slowly being more and more unified in their want and passion to change their lives, essentially. That brings us to the end. I can't do justice to any of these uprisings in the time that I've got, and I've already gone on for longer than I normally would, so I'm going to end it there. But if you've got any comments on this, or if you like it, please leave a comment, share it around, and hopefully you've enjoyed listening to the stories of 3 of these riots. But please go out, read some books on them, find out more, because there is a lot more to find out about all 3 of them, in particular 1831. So thank you very much for listening, and stay safe.